The battle began the way all battles begin, with someone deciding that the space between two peoples was not large enough. Admiral Thessan gave the order at 0400 ship time, and 400 vessels of the Terran Confederacy dropped out of FTL transit like a fist unclenching, their drives bleeding violet light across the dark. On the other side of the Crestfall Nebula's inner belt, the Kroth Armada had been waiting. They always waited. Waiting was how the Kroth fought, patient, geological, the way a mountain waits for the river to tire itself out. But this time the Confederacy had arrived with enough firepower to make the mountain blink. Rin Castor felt the battle through his fighter's hull before he saw it. Vibration in the grip struts. A low harmonic that lived below sound, translated through metal into bone. He sat in the cockpit of his Viper-class interceptor, designation 7 Ghost, painted black from nose to thruster cowl, and watched the tactical display bloom red as 400 Kroth warships answered the Confederacy's arrival by opening fire simultaneously. The Crestfall Nebula did the rest. Ionized gas caught the energy discharge and lit up like a dying star's last breath, gold and copper and a deep arterial red that no human color word quite covered, a hue that existed in the space between dying and burning. Ghost Squadron, form up. Wing Commander Yara's voice was flat, professional, already somewhere past fear. We're punching through their destroyer screen. Stay tight, stay fast. Missiles hot. Rin checked his restraints. Half human, half something else, the genetic legacy of a mother who'd been taken and returned changed, who'd never spoken of what she'd seen or what had been done. He sat differently in a cockpit than full-blooded pilots. His shoulders were wider, the vertebrae of his spine slightly elongated, his eyes capable of processing light at a range that sometimes made other pilots uneasy. He saw the nebula differently than they did. He saw it the way his mother had sometimes looked at sunsets, with a recognition that went deeper than aesthetics, something the human part of him didn't have words for and the other part of him didn't need them. He pushed the throttle forward and followed his wing into the fire. What followed was 47 minutes of controlled chaos that military historians would later call the Battle of Crestfall, though everyone who survived it called it something shorter and more profane. The Kroth destroyers opened corridors of suppressing fire so dense that the interceptors had to fly through geometric patterns of energy discharge that left afterimages burned into pilots' vision for hours afterward. Rin flew by instinct and something more, that other inheritance, a spatial awareness that functioned like a sixth sense, reading the three-dimensional battlefield as a shape rather than a collection of individual threats. He cut inside a Kroth corvette's turning radius and put 2 missiles into its engine housing before the gunner could track him. He barrel-rolled through a crossfire that should have killed him and came out the other side with only a scorched stabilizer fin. He watched 3 pilots from his squadron, people he'd eaten with, argued with, gotten drunk with on station leave, vanish in moments so brief they barely registered as light. He was lining up a shot on a Kroth command frigate, a massive vessel, its hull plated in the dark ceramic alloy the Kroth preferred, smooth and jointless as a shell, when the world ended. Not the world. His world. The small personal world of 7 Ghost. Something hit his port engine from below and behind, a shot he never saw coming, fired from a position he hadn't tracked. The explosion was intimate, almost quiet, a compression wave rather than a roar, because space doesn't roar, and then his cockpit was full of smoke and the screaming of tearing metal and the tactical display was a carnival of red warnings and he was spinning, the Crestfall Nebula wheeling past his canopy in great sweeps of dying color, and below him in the gravitational sense, the direction the spin was sending him, a moon. Dark. Cratered. The color of old iron. Moros. He knew the name from the charts. Dead moon of the gas giant Theron 4. No atmosphere worth breathing. No thermal signature. No known biology. Just rock and ancient impact craters and the kind of deep silence that settled over places where nothing had ever lived. The charts, as it turned out, were wrong. His emergency systems were trying to talk to him. Altitude warnings, pressure warnings, the evacuation protocol chiming in his ear like a polite suggestion while his ship fell apart around him. He killed the evacuation protocol. Ejecting into the battle above was a death sentence. The debris field alone would shred him. Better to ride 7 Ghost down. Better to trust the heat shielding that was currently ablating in sheets of orange fire across his canopy. Better to trust the landing jets that were... He checked. 3 of 4 still functional, which was something, which was enough to slow him from unsurvivable to merely catastrophic. He hit Moros at an angle, bouncing once across a flat plateau of ancient rock, the impact slamming him forward against his restraints hard enough to turn his vision white. The second contact was worse, a ravine, narrower than he'd wanted, the wingtips shearing off against the stone walls in twin explosions of sparks and metal. Then stillness. The sound of cooling metal. The sound of his own breathing, ragged and wet at the edges, a rib either cracked or bruised, his left hand bleeding from where the grip strut had buckled into it. He sat there for a moment that had no measurable duration. Then he unstrapped himself, and got to work on not dying. The atmosphere was thin but present, a fact the charts had also missed, or more likely understated. Nitrogen heavy, with enough oxygen that his emergency breather could supplement rather than replace, extending his canister reserves significantly. He pulled the survival kit from beneath his seat, emergency rations, a thermal blanket, a short-range scanner, his sidearm, a Confederacy-issue pulse pistol, compact, reliable, with 14 charges in the pack, and a cutting tool that doubled as a pry bar. He catalogued these items with the focused attention of someone who understood that they were now the entire material foundation of his continued existence. 7 Ghost was dead. The hull was intact enough to provide shelter, which mattered, but the engines were gone, the communication array was gone, the navigation systems were scrap. He had what was on his back and what was in his hands, and above him, too far to see through the thin murk of Moroz's atmosphere, 400 ships on each side were still tearing each other apart. He set up a rudimentary camp inside the cockpit, thermal blanket, rations he wasn't hungry for, scanner running a passive sweep of the surrounding terrain. The plateau he'd crashed on was roughly 2 kilometers wide, bounded to the north by the ravine his wings had excavated and to the south by a long slope that fell toward what the scanner suggested was a lower geological shelf. Ancient impact craters pocked the surface at intervals, their edges worn soft by whatever eons of whatever had worn at this moon without leaving anything alive. He was treating the cut on his hand with the kit's medical sealant when the scanner chimed. Thermal signature. Large. Approximately 340 meters southwest, and getting closer. He set down the sealant, picked up the pulse pistol, checked the charge, full, and moved to the edge of his broken cockpit to look out at the gray iron landscape of Moros. The figure coming across the plateau was not human. It was large, nearly 2.5 meters, with a dense, forward-weighted build of the Croth warrior caste, shoulders that strained the environment suit, a helmet that swept back into 2 blunt horns that were structural, part of the suit's design, echoing a biological fact underneath. It moved with a limp, left leg, significant, but it moved steadily, with a kind of purposeful momentum that suggested something that did not permit itself to stop. Under one arm it carried a piece of hull plating like a shield. In its other hand it carried a weapon that Rin didn't recognize but understood immediately from the way it was held, a Croth-close combat blade, long as his forearm, curved, built for something with hands larger than his. The Croth hadn't seen him yet, or had seen the wreck and was approaching to assess. Rin stepped out from behind the cockpit with the pistol raised. "Stop there." His voice carried oddly in the thin air. Flatter than it should have been, the consonants strange and clipped. The Croth stopped. Its helmet turned toward him with that smooth, considered rotation that the warrior caste used, never a startled snap of the head, always a controlled pivot, as if the world was something to be assessed rather than reacted to. There was a long silence, long enough for Rin to count his own heartbeats. 7, 8, 9. "Half-breed," the Croth said. Its voice through the external speaker was a bass register that Rin felt in his breastbone. The translator implant in his ear processed the Croth language and returned the word in standard, half-breed, with a flatness that stripped out whatever inflection the speaker had used, though Rin suspected inflection was not really the point. "Your ship is destroyed. So is yours." Rin kept the pistol level. His hand was steady. The rib made breathing slightly interesting. "Southwest. About 800 meters. I tracked it on the way down." Another silence. The Croth looked at him with the lens-dark faceplate of its helmet. "I am Vorek," it said. "Blade Commander, first reach of the Croth hegemony. It was I who shot you down." The frankness of this was so absolute that Rin almost laughed. Almost. Rin Castor. 7 Ghost Wing, Confederacy Interceptor Corps. He kept the pistol aimed at the center mass of the figure in front of him. "You came to finish the job?" "I came," Vorek said, and now there was something in the translated voice, some quality the implant couldn't quite flatten, "because my ship also has no communications." And yours was the nearest crash site with a thermal signature that indicated survival. So you need something from me. I need, Vorek said, very precisely, to determine whether there is a way off this moon. Rin lowered the pistol slightly. Not all the way. My comms array is gone. I am aware. I can see it from here. A pause. Your emergency transponder is also destroyed. I can also see this. The battle's still going on up there. If it ends, when it ends, whoever wins sends recovery teams. Recovery teams come for their own. They sweep for survivors. They sweep for their own survivors. Vorek set the hull plating down, slowly, and straightened to its full height. The limp had not come from the leg. Rin could see now that the left side of the suit had been scored by something, the insulation layer partially compromised. Vorek was managing heat loss. Slowly, but managing it. I did not come to finish what I started, Rin Castor. I came because this moon is not as it was mapped, and I will not remain stationary after what I found between here and my wreck. Rin felt something shift in the quality of the silence around them. Not the words, the way Vorek said them. The Kroth warrior caste was not, as a category, given to the admission of unease. They were given to the management of it, the processing of it into something tactical. What Rin heard in Vorek's translated voice was not fear, exactly, but a military mind's recategorization of a situation from manageable to requiring additional data. What did you find? Rin asked. Vorek looked down at the ground beneath their feet. Then back up at Rin. Holes, it said. New ones. Not impact craters. The edges are wrong. Not meteorological. They go down. Rin looked at the scanner in his free hand. The passive sweep was showing him the plateau, the ravine, the slope to the south. Not showing him anything underground because he hadn't thought to look underground, because the moon was mapped as dead. He switched the scanner to subsurface mode and watched the display populate. The tunnels ran everywhere beneath them. Branching, interconnected, some of them 2 meters across, some of them much wider. A network that made the plateau's surface look like the ceiling of a cave system so extensive it might encompass the entire moon. And there, thermal signatures. Multiple. Moving. How far back was the nearest one? Rin asked. His voice came out very level, which he was pleased about. 80 meters, Vorek said. Between my wreck and your position. A pause. It was large. And it was aware of me. It tracked my movement by, I believe, either sound or heat differential. It stopped following me when I stopped moving. Rin looked at the scanner. Looked at the tunnels. Looked at the thermal signatures moving through them in patterns that were not random. Nothing random ever moved quite like that, with that kind of distributed, purposeful drift. He looked at Vorek. The Kroth commander looked back at him. Neither ship can fly, Rin said. Correct. And if we separate, we each have half the information and half the resources. Vorek was quiet for a moment. This is also correct. I have a pulse pistol with 14 charges. He held it up. What do you have? This. The blade. And 12 charges in my sidearm, which is a Kroth Threnner pattern, not compatible with your weapon. A beat. And a portable thermal regulator, which will slow the heat loss from my suit. And I have the scanner and the medical kit and the rations. Then we have, Vorek said, as if weighing each word on a scale calibrated to survival, a situation. Rin lowered the pistol the rest of the way. He didn't holster it. If this goes badly, he said, I will absolutely still shoot you. If this goes badly, Vorek replied, you will not need to. They worked through the first 2 hours in a silence that was not comfortable but was functional, a silence with structure to it, the kind that forms between people who have decided to share a task without yet deciding to share anything else. Rin used the cutting tool on 7 Ghost's secondary power cell, bypassing the fried relay circuits to get a direct feed to the scanner's deep-range array. Vorek, with a precision that surprised Rin, used the Kroth blade to strip insulation from the hull plating it had been carrying and fashioned a repair patch for the compromised section of its suit. Both of them worked without asking for help, without offering it, watching each other in the peripheral way of people who have trained themselves to maintain awareness without appearing to. The scanner, now running on 7 Ghost's reserve power, gave them a much clearer picture of the tunnels below. Rin studied it for a long time before he described what he was seeing to Vorek, who crouched beside him. The disparity in their heights made looking at things together geometrically complicated, and processed the display with the focused stillness of a commander reading a strategic map. "The central tunnel structure," Vorek said. "Here. It is larger than the others. A primary passage. Could be natural. Could be architectural. On a dead moon." "On a moon that is not dead," Rin corrected, and Vorek made a sound that the translator rendered as a non-committal acknowledgement, which was as close to fair point as Rin suspected Vorek was currently willing to get. What the scanner showed, once they had enough resolution to interpret it, was not simply a cave system. The tunnels were too regular in cross-section, their branching patterns too geometrically consistent. Something had made them. Something with intention. And the thermal signatures, there were 9 of them now, which was more than there had been 20 minutes ago, or else the same ones had moved in ways that made them appear to multiply, were concentrated in the passages closest to the surface, as if whatever lived in the tunnels below was aware of the disturbance on the surface above and was ascending to investigate. The crashes. The engine fire. The heat signatures of 2 living beings walking across the plateau. "Sound and heat," Vorek had said. "It hunts sound and heat." Rin looked at the sky. The battle was still happening up there. He could see the occasional bright smear of a drive trail through the murk, a distant flash that might have been a ship's end. He had no way to know how it was going. He had no way to know anything about anything that existed beyond the roughly 2-kilometer circle of this plateau, except that beneath it, in the dark, something that was not mapped and not accounted for was paying attention to them. "We need higher ground," Rin said. "The ravine edge. It gives us a view of the approach from the slope, and the tunnel density drops north of here." Vorek looked at the scanner. Looked at the ravine. "The edge is unstable in sections. I observed fracture patterns in the stone on my approach." "I know. But the alternative is staying here, on top of the densest part of the tunnel network, with creatures underneath us that are already moving toward the surface." A pause. "You are correct," Vorek said, which costed something. Rin could hear the cost in the slight flatness of the translated words, the Kroth equivalent of swallowing something down. "We move." They packed what they had and crossed the plateau in the gray half-light of Theron 4's reflected glow. The gas giant filled roughly a quarter of the sky, banded amber and ivory, immense and indifferent, lit from within by its own slow chemistry. It made the landscape of Moros look like a ruin. Which it was, Rin supposed. Everything was a ruin of something. Vorek moved well despite the leg, which Rin revised. The gait wasn't injury, he decided, but adaptation. Kroth Warrior Caste moved with a weight-forward lean that made human observers read it as a limp, but it was actually a combat stance. Integrated so deeply into the musculature that it persisted even in casual movement. Vorek was not injured. Or not primarily. The suit damage might be causing some localized numbness, which it was compensating for, but it moved like something that had been in difficult places before and knew how to manage itself. They reached the ravine edge. The drop was perhaps 15 meters. The walls where 7 ghosts' wings had sheared through them still raw, the stone pale as bone at the breaks. Rin found a section that was stable and set the scanner down, running continuous subsurface monitoring, and they waited. 20 minutes. 40. An hour. The scanner tracked the signatures moving below, ascending, spreading, probing the upper tunnel layers. But not breaking through. Not yet. And in the silence of waiting, with nothing to do but watch the display and watch each other intermittently, Rin said something he hadn't intended to say. "My mother was taken by the Kroth. When I was 4. Vorek was sitting with its back against the ravine-edge stone, the blade across its knees. It did not move. Returned. 2 years later. Changed. She never said how, or what they did. She lived another 12 years, and then she didn't." He paused. "I'm not telling you this to make a point. I'm telling you because if something comes up through that rock in the next 10 minutes and kills both of us, it seemed like a thing I should have said to someone." Vorek was quiet for a moment that stretched out into the iron landscape. "The Kroth took your mother," it said finally. "In what year of the standard reckoning?" 2271. Early in the war. The first expansion. I was a young commander then. I lost soldiers I would not have lost if we had been differently ordered." Another pause. I am not apologizing for the Kroth. I am saying that in 2271 I knew what we were doing and I believed it necessary, and now I sit on a dead moon that is not dead with the half-breed son of a woman we took, and I find the categories of necessary and unnecessary have become less clear to me in the intervening years. Rin looked at him. That's not an apology either. No, it is not. Something in the translated voice that might, in the original language, have been very dry. We do not apologize. We account. What's the difference? Apology asks for absolution. Accounting simply establishes the record. Vorek looked at the scanner display between them. I shot you down today. That is in the record. My record and yours. I do not ask you to forgive it. I wasn't planning to. Good. Forgiveness would be strategically unsound given our situation. And there it was, not warmth, not camaraderie, not the movie version of enemies becoming friends over shared honesty. Just two people in a bad place, acknowledging each other's existence with something slightly more than hostility. Which, given the starting position, was its own kind of progress. The scanner screamed. Not the chime of a notification. A full alarm, every threshold tripping simultaneously, because 7 of the 9 thermal signatures had just moved from the upper tunnel layer to the surface in under 4 seconds, breaking through, erupting, at points distributed across the plateau in a pattern that was either random or deliberately encircling, and the difference didn't matter because they were here, they were above ground, and the first one came up 30 meters south of the ravine edge in an explosion of fractured stone and displaced earth that Rin felt through the soles of his boots. He had the pulse pistol up before the stone had finished settling. What came out of the ground was large, and wrong, and real in the way that things are real when they exist in front of you regardless of whether they are supposed to. 6 limbs, 4 for locomotion, 2 forwardly adapted into something that functioned like arms, ending in thick, recurved structures that were not quite claws and not quite hands. No eyes that Rin could identify. The head was a flattened wedge, smooth on top, with a lateral array of structures along the jawline that vibrated continuously, picking up sound? Heat differential? Both. The body was pale, the color of things that live away from light, with a faint bioluminescence along the seams between its articulated plates that pulsed with its movement. It was the size of a large vehicle. It moved with a speed that bodies that size were not supposed to possess, and the sound it made was a subsonic pulse that Rin felt in his sinuses and his joints. Move, Vorek said, and was already moving. Not away, but sideways, putting 15 meters between itself and Rin so they weren't clustered, so the creature would have to choose, so they became 2 problems instead of 1. Rin fired. The pulse round hit the creature in the lateral jaw structures and it recoiled. Not hurt, he thought, or not significantly, but disturbed, recalibrating, the sensory array disrupted momentarily. He used the moment to get to higher stone, a ridge of rock along the ravine edge that gave him 2 meters of elevation and a slightly longer reaction window. 2 more broke the surface. 1 to the east, 50 meters. 1 between them and 7 Ghosts' wreck, blocking the most obvious retreat. Scanner, Vorek called. Rin looked at it. 4 still subsurface. Moving toward breach points. 4 more coming up. North and northwest. The ravine. Too far and the edge is unstable. The ravine. Vorek was already moving toward it, angling toward a section 30 meters north of their position, and Rin understood. Not shelter, not escape, but a choke point. The ravine walls were stone, no tunnel penetration in that section. The creatures couldn't surround them if they controlled a narrow approach. It wasn't safety. It was defensible, which was different. He ran. The creature that had emerged first tracked his movement. He could feel it orient to him, all those jaw sensors sweeping toward his heat signature, his footfalls, and he ran noisily for 3 steps and then went completely silent for 2, planting his feet softly, and the creature's head swung a meter past his actual position, recalculating. He used the gap to dive behind a half-buried boulder and rolled to his feet on the far side, pulse pistol up, and fired at the second creature that was converging from the east, catching it in the softer membrane where the front limbs joined the body. This one screamed, a sound that existed partly below the range of hearing and partly at a frequency that made Rin's vision blur at the edges, and wheeled, striking the ground with its arm limbs in a display that might have been pain or might have been communication. He kept moving. North. Toward Vorek. The Kroth commander was at the ravine edge, not a section of it that Rin would have chosen, There was fracture webbing in the stone. He'd noted it on the approach, but positioned between two outcroppings that created a natural corner, back protected, field of approach limited. It had the blade out and the sidearm in its other hand, and as Rin came in from the south it fired twice in rapid succession at the creature that had emerged northwest, the Croth Threnner rounds hitting with more concussive force than Rin's pulse weapon, staggering the creature backward. "Behind you," Rin said, not shouting, because shouting made noise and noise attracted attention, and was beside Vorek with the pulse pistol tracking the creature that had followed him north. Two of them now in front. Two more emerging at the edges of scanner range. For still below, moving toward concentration. "They coordinate," Vorek said. "I know. The subsonic pulses. Communication. I know." Rin watched them. The two creatures in front had stopped advancing and were doing something, circling slowly, exchanging pulses, their jaw sensors aimed not at Rin and Vorek but at the space between each other. "They're planning. Animals do not plan. These do." He watched the display on the scanner, balanced on a flat rock nearby. The subsurface signatures had consolidated, 4 of them now, directly below. "Vorek. Directly underneath us. 4 of them. A beat. How far below?" 12 meters. And the tunnel density. The ground moved. Not an earthquake. Not impact. A targeted collapse, the creatures below driving upward at a structural weak point, destabilizing the rock above the main tunnel. The fracture webbing in the stone that Rin had noted transmitted it like a telegraph, the hairline cracks propagating outward from a central point 3 meters south of where they stood, and then the section of ravine edge that Vorek had considered and dismissed as unstable became unstable all at once, a chunk of it the size of a small vehicle dropping away into the ravine below with a sound like a door closing. And Vorek went with it. Not entirely. Not into the free fall. The drop was 15 meters onto ravine floor stone, unsurvivable at that speed, but the sudden collapse of the edge pulled it sideways, its feet going out from under it on newly angled stone, and Vorek caught the edge with one massive hand, the blade falling away into the dark below, hanging by that grip while the two creatures in front began to move again and the stone beneath Rin's own feet was still shifting, the fracture propagating, and the scanner was alarming. And Vorek was hanging from one hand over a 15-meter drop. Rin had 4 seconds. Maybe 3. He fired once at the nearer creature, the pulse round hitting the sensory array, buying disruption, and then he covered the 3 meters between him and the ravine edge and threw himself flat on the stone, reaching down, and Vorek caught his outstretched hand with its free one. The grip was extraordinary. Croth warrior caste, genetically adapted for combat, Vorek weighed perhaps 180 kilograms in this gravity, and for one moment that entire weight transferred through Rin's arm and shoulder, and the rib that was cracked was definitely cracked, not bruised. The pain a bright specific thing that his body noted and filed away for later attention, because later was when he would have the luxury of pain. He pulled. He braced his other hand against the edge stone. Stable stone, he'd chosen it. He'd chosen this spot specifically. And he pulled, and Vorek's other hand found purchase, and for a count of 3 they were in stasis, both of them working against physics, and then Vorek was up, rolling over the edge onto the stable ground, and Rin was already turning back to the creatures because they had used those 3 seconds and were 20 meters closer and coming fast. He fired 3 times. 2 hits, 1 miss. The creatures recoiled but did not retreat. Vorek was on its feet. Without the blade. Left hand against its side. It had impacted something on the way down or the way up, ribs of its own, perhaps, though Croth ribs were denser and more numerous than human ones. It assessed the situation in the time it took Rin to fire twice more, and then it reached under a secondary panel on its suit and produced a second object, a compact cylindrical device that Rin recognized, after a moment, as a thermal emitter. The portable regulator it had mentioned. "Cover your scanner," Vorek said. "What?" "The thermal regulator. If I discharge it fully and concentrate the output outward, it will produce a heat differential significant enough to—" It looked at the creatures, who were pulsing at each other again, recalibrating. "They hunt heat. A sufficiently disorienting heat source, applied directly to the sensory array. You'll lose your suit regulation." "I am aware. Your suit is already compromised. Without the regulator." "I am aware, Rin Castor." Not angry. The flatness again. The accounting. "Cover your scanner. The emitter discharge will affect it." Rin covered the scanner with his body. He heard Vorek move, those careful, weighted steps, and then a sound he had no reference for, a sustained high-frequency emission, and the creature's subsonic communication collapsed into chaos. The jaw sensors swept wildly, the lateral arrays overwhelmed, the things lurching into each other, into the stone, into the air where Rin and Vorek were not, disoriented in a way that looked almost like pain but was probably something more fundamental, the removal of the sense they used to construct their world. "Run," Vorek said, and they ran. North along the ravine edge, past the section that had collapsed, onto ground the scanner had showed was tunnel-free for nearly 400 meters. The creatures did not follow immediately. Their recalibration would take time, and the artificial heat point Vorek had created behind them would continue to confuse the sensors for minutes. Rin ran with the scanner and the pulse pistol and the broken rib and the knowledge that they were alive, specifically, because of decisions made in the last 90 seconds that he would not have predicted making 48 hours ago when this had been a war with clear sides and clear enemies. They stopped behind a formation of black stone, volcanic, ancient, thrust up at a sharp angle like a broken tooth from the surface. Vorek leaned against it. Rin checked the scanner. The creatures were still on the surface behind them, milling, confused, slowly reorganizing. The subsurface signatures had spread back out, the coordinated ascent dissolved. They had time, but not much, and the word time suddenly resolved into a specific meaning. Not time to rest, but time to think. "Your suit," Rin said, "is compromised." Vorek looked at the thermal emitter, which was spent, its casing warm to the touch. The insulation layer was already damaged. Without active regulation. How long? Vorek considered this with what appeared to be the same precision it applied to everything. In this ambient temperature, with reduced atmospheric protection, 3 hours before core temperature becomes a significant problem. Perhaps 4. Rin did not say "I'm sorry" because Vorek would not receive it as the thing it would be. He said, "Then we need to solve 2 problems at once. The creatures, and the suit, and the ship." He was already thinking about the ships, not Seven Ghost, which was genuinely finished, but Vorek's wreck, 800 meters southwest. He'd tracked it on the scanner since they'd started running. It had a thermal signature that Seven Ghost didn't, residual power. Not engine power, not flight power, but power, which meant systems, which meant possibilities. "What was the state of your ship when you left it?" Vorek turned slowly to look at him. "You cannot fly a Kroth fighter." "I cannot fly it, no. But I can read a power schematic, and I am very good at making things do things they weren't originally designed to do, which is a skill I developed," he paused, "growing up as what I am. Can you fly a Kroth fighter on one working engine if we can get one working?" A long pause. "Depending on the extent of the damage. The primary drive housing on my ship was intact when I left it. The port engine is destroyed, but the starboard may be salvageable. The navigation system is secondary. The communication array was damaged, not destroyed." Rin looked at the scanner. Looked at the route between their position and Vorek's wreck. The tunnel density was highest between them and it. The creatures had been working that area, and the surface was riddled with the breach holes Vorek had first described. Any route was through contested ground. "We have the scanner," he said. "We watch the signatures, we move between them, we go quiet when we need to go quiet. The suit's heat signature will." "I know. That's why we move fast. If we're a moving target, they have to track rather than converge." He met Vorek's opaque faceplate with the place where he thought Vorek's eyes were. "I'm going to help you get to your ship. And you're going to help me fly it out of here." Another pause. When Vorek spoke, its voice had changed slightly, something that the translator rendered as an unchanged flatness but that Rin's half-alien auditory processing caught as a modulation, a frequency shift in the Kroth speech that the implant wasn't calibrated to interpret but that his bones knew, somehow, the way his bones knew other things. "Why?" Vorek said. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. Rin picked up the scanner. "Because you could have not come to my crash site. You could have stayed with your own wreck and waited, or started walking in another direction. You came here because you calculated that cooperation improved both our survival odds. I'm making the same calculation." He started moving south, checking the display. "That's all it is." He didn't look back, but he heard Vorek follow, those heavy careful steps on the gray stone of Moros, and the lie that he just told settled into the air between them and dissolved, because they both knew it wasn't all it was, and the knowledge of that sat there alongside everything else. The crashed ships and the dead moon that wasn't dead and the battle still going on somewhere above them and the creatures that hunted sound and heat, as something that neither of them was going to name yet, but that both of them were carrying. The route to Vorek's ship took them 90 minutes, which was 80 minutes longer than the distance required and 10 minutes shorter than Rin had feared. They moved in the stops and starts of careful soldiers, using the scanner to read the subsurface signatures and timing their movements through the open ground between tunnel concentrations. 3 times they went completely still and silent, pressed against stone or behind impact crater lips, as creatures moved below them or as one of the surface-breached individuals tracked heat signatures in their direction, head sweeping, jaw sensors working, eventually turning away when the signal was too dispersed or too static to locate precisely. Vorek was cooling. Not dramatically. The Kroth physiology ran hotter than human and had more thermal mass to give up, but Rin could read the changes in the way it moved. Slightly slower decisions. A fraction more effort in the careful foot placements. The core temperature dropping in the way that the center of a large thing drops slowly and then, past a certain point, all at once. He didn't say anything about it. Vorek knew its own body better than Rin did, and there was nothing useful to add to the information they both already had. The Kroth fighter was a wreck, but it was a wreck with parts. It had come down harder than Seven Ghost, the nose was buried 2 meters into the plateau surface, and the port engine housing was simply gone, sheared off in the landing, taking the left wing with it, but the starboard engine housing was intact, the cockpit was pressurized, and when Vorek entered through the emergency release and powered up the auxiliary systems, the displays bloomed to life with a particular cool blue-green that Kroth interface design favored, text and symbols that Rin could not read but could observe Vorek reading, watching the face behind the faceplate process information with the controlled intensity of a commander doing triage on a strategic situation. Starboard engine, Vorek said. 63% capacity. Navigation, functional but degraded, I can get a fix but not fine adjustments. A pause. Communications array, damaged, as I said, but the carrier frequency is intact. I can broadcast an emergency signal. Whether anyone receives it in current conditions. Broadcast it, Rin said. Constantly. If the battle ends, someone will hear it. The battle. Vorek looked at the cockpit display. Tracking, I can pull the battlefield data. Partial, at this range, with this array. It worked the interface. Rin watched. The display populated with icons and positions, a partial tactical picture of what was happening above Moros, and both of them went quiet looking at it. The battle was ending. Confederacy forces had broken the Kroth destroyer screen and were pushing hard into the command frigate formations. The Kroth armada was consolidating, not retreating exactly. The Kroth didn't retreat, exactly, they repositioned, but pulling back from Crestfall, reorganizing around the gas giant's far side. Which meant that the Confederacy would push through. Which meant that recovery teams would come through, sweeping for survivors. Which meant that a signal from Moros would be heard. You need to be on this ship, Rin said. Vorek looked at him. When the Confederacy recovery team comes, they'll pull a Confederacy signal. If I'm the one transmitting, they'll come for me. Your signal alone, he paused. Kroth prisoners are not a priority. No, Vorek agreed. We are not. But if I'm transmitting alongside you, or if I'm transmitting from this ship, he looked at the cockpit. Single-seat design. Kroth scale. Can you get both of us in there? Vorek looked at the cockpit. Looked at Rin. You are not small for a human. I've noticed. I am large even for Kroth. I've also noticed. A pause. It will be extremely unpleasant. Most things about today have been. The engine repair took 2 hours. Rin worked on the external housing, his hands smaller, better suited to the access panels than Vorek's, while Vorek directed from the cockpit, talking him through the Kroth engineering logic with a patience that was clearly effortful and clearly genuine, a patience that came from someone who had decided that the task mattered more than the irritation of explaining things to someone who couldn't read the schematics. Rin followed the logic rather than the labels and found that Kroth engineering, at its structural level, obeyed the same physics everything else obeyed, and that physics was a language he spoke well enough. One of the creatures emerged 200 meters north of them during the second hour. They went still. It was one of the smaller ones, if smaller was a useful word, since it was still the size of a large vehicle, and it moved across the surface in the searching pattern, jaw sensors working, subsonic pulses going out and returning. It came within 80 meters and then turned and went back to a breech hole and descended. Rin's hand was shaking slightly when he returned to the engine coupling. He noticed it and made it stop. The engine came to life at 0317, a sound that was more felt than heard, a deep throb through the hull that was the sound of possibility. 63% capacity. Enough for vertical ascent. Enough to reach orbital altitude. Enough to broadcast the signal loud enough that even in the chaos of battle's aftermath, someone would hear it. They were both in the cockpit. Extremely unpleasant was accurate but insufficient. Vorek occupied the seat. Rin occupied the space that was not the seat but was in the cockpit, braced between the instrument panel and the back wall in a configuration that required his knees to be somewhere that knees didn't naturally go and his broken rib to be in contact with a support strut in a way that made every breath a small deliberate act. "I've started the broadcast," Vorek said. "How long for someone to respond?" "Unknown. The battle data shows Confederacy forces sweeping through the sector in, it processed the display, perhaps 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Rin looked at the cockpit displays. Looked at the engine readings. Looked at the scanner he'd propped against the instrument panel, still showing subsurface signatures, still showing the creatures below moving in their distributed, patient way, managing themselves around two sources of heat and sound that had been disrupting their world for hours now. He thought about the creatures. About the tunnel network beneath them, the geological complexity of it, the intelligence that had coordinated those attacks, those flanking movements, the deliberate structural collapse. He thought about the charts that had said this moon was dead. He thought about what it meant that something lived here, had been living here, in tunnels beneath a moon that the war between his people and Vorek's people had catalogued as irrelevant and moved on from. He thought about his mother, who had come back from the Croth changed, who had looked at sunsets differently, who had known something about the universe that she didn't have human words for. Vorek. Yes. The creatures. When you were tracking them, before you came to my crash site. You observed them for how long? Perhaps 20 minutes before I began moving toward your position. What were they doing? Before we were here. Before the crashes. Vorek was quiet for a moment. Moving. In patterns. Complex ones. Not feeding, not hunting. Moving in the tunnels in ways that were, a pause, difficult to categorize. Social behavior. Perhaps. Or something else. Something we don't have a category for, because they're not anything we've studied. Rin stared at the scanner display. We've been on this moon for hours and we've assumed they were a threat. They responded to us the way any species responds to large disruptive events in their environment. Heat sources they've never encountered. Sound signatures that don't match anything in their ecology. They attacked us. We crashed into their home. A pause. We were sitting on top of their tunnel network with active thermal signatures and noisy equipment and then 2 engine fires. Vorek turned its head, that slow, deliberate rotation. You are suggesting they were defending territory. I'm suggesting the charts called this moon dead because we never looked carefully enough. And that something that lives in tunnels across an entire moon has been here for... He thought about the geological regularity of the tunnels, the age of the stone, longer than the war. Longer than us. Vorek looked at the scanner. The signatures below were quiet now, distributed, no longer ascending. We have 90 minutes, it said. Yes. And 1 seat. Rin didn't respond. The word one sat in the cockpit between them, and they both looked at it from different angles, and Rin understood that they had each been understanding this for different amounts of time. I can give you the Confederacy signal protocols, Rin said. Broadcast codes that will flag a Confederacy recovery team. They'll pull any signal transmitting them, regardless of the ship's origin. You are certain of this? I'm certain enough. He looked at the engine readings. 63%. More than enough for 1 person. More than enough to reach orbital altitude and maintain position for the recovery team. With 2 people in this configuration, the power draw was higher, the ascent angle would need to be more conservative, the time in atmosphere longer. With one, it was clean. You did not calculate this when you said we would both get in, Vorek said. I calculated it before I said it. A pause. I made a different decision then. And now? Rin looked at the cockpit. At the scanner. at the display showing the battle resolving above them, the Confederacy advancing through the sector. He looked at Vorek, at the opaque faceplate, at the Kroth commander who had shot him down and come to his crash site and been frank about killing his mother's people and carried a hull plate across a dead moon and used the last functioning component of a damaged suit to save both their lives, and he thought about what accounting meant, what it meant to establish a record, what it meant to live in the space between who you were and who the situation required you to be. "I'm going to give you the signal protocols," he said. "And I'm going to get out of this cockpit." The silence was very complete. "You cannot survive here," Vorek said. "Without the suit regulator. Without. I have 7 Ghosts hull as shelter. The emergency rations. The scanner. And..." He thought about the creatures, about the subsonic pulses, about the patterns that were hard to categorize. "And I have a hypothesis." "A hypothesis." "About whether it's possible to not be perceived as a threat, if you're sufficiently still, sufficiently quiet, sufficiently present without disruption." He looked at the scanner, the tunnels, the network. "I've been reading it for hours. I think I understand some of the patterns. Not enough, but some." Vorek was absolutely still in the way that things are still when they are processing something that exceeds their categories. "You will not be recovered," it said. "The Confederacy recovery sweep will not return to this moon. Once the signal is answered, they will move on." "I know. And the Kroth will not come here." "I know that too." "Then explain," Vorek said very quietly, "what you are doing." Rin thought about it for a moment that was real and not performed. He thought about his mother, who had come back changed and had lived 12 years in the change and had sometimes looked at the world as if she was still figuring out what she was seeing. He thought about the thing in him that wasn't human, the inheritance he'd spent his life managing rather than inhabiting. He thought about the tunnels beneath them, ancient and organized and inhabited by something that had a language he could feel in his sinuses. "Something lives here," he said. "And nobody knows it does. And when this war ends, one way or another, the Confederacy and the Kroth will draw new borders and sign new agreements, and some of those borders will go through the system, and someone will build something on Moros, a station or a sensor array or a refueling depot, because it's close to Theron 4 and it shows as dead on the maps." He paused. "I'm choosing to know about it. To stay and know about it, so that when the record is eventually established." "You are one person." "My mother was one person." He moved, carefully, the rib made moving carefully a necessity, and began extracting himself from the space that was not the seat. "Give them time to know I'm different before they decide I'm a threat. That's the hypothesis. If I'm wrong, I won't be here long enough to be wrong about much else." He was out. Standing on the stone of Moros, outside the cockpit, the thin atmosphere against his emergency breather, Theron 4 enormous and amber in the sky above him. The battle's traces were still visible, distant drive trails, the faint luminescence of cooling weapon fire in the nebula gas. He looked at Vorek in the cockpit. "Broadcast the Confederacy codes. Maintain altitude once you breach atmosphere. The recovery team will lock on fast, you won't have to hold long." He handed the scanner through the cockpit opening. "Keep monitoring until you're in range of the recovery ship systems. The underground network extends," he tapped the display, "to approximately the northern equator." "Worth knowing." Vorek looked at the scanner. Looked at him. "The Kroth do not account to those who..." It stopped. Started again. "There is no precedent in Kroth tradition for what you are doing." "I know. I will record it accurately." The translated words were flat, but the frequency beneath them was not, and Rin's bones knew the difference. "Whatever the record eventually means, I will record it accurately." Rin stepped back from the ship. "That's enough," he said. The engine sound deepened. Dust and small stones moved outward from the landing struts as thrust built. Rin walked north, to higher ground, away from the exhaust, and watched the Kroth fighter lift, unsteadily, with a vibration that spoke of 63% capacity doing the work of a full engine, the single thruster pushing the asymmetric hull with determined imprecision into the sky above Moros. He watched it until the drive trail was one more streak of light against the Crestfall nebula. Then he sat down on the stone of the dead moon. He put his hands flat on the surface, feeling the faint vibration in the rock, deep, periodic, subsonic, that had been there all along once he was quiet enough to feel it. He closed his eyes. He let his breathing slow and quiet. He let the heat of him settle into the stillness of the environment instead of flaring against it, the thermal signature of a body at rest rather than a body in crisis. He had 400 calories of emergency rations. He had a pulse pistol with 9 charges remaining. He had a broken rib and a cut hand sealed with medical sealant, and the knowledge that somewhere above him a Kroth commander was broadcasting his coordinates to people who would come. For Vorek, not for him, but come nonetheless, and in the coming would establish that Moros was inhabited by something worth knowing about. He had, underneath him, something that had been here long before either of his peoples had reached this part of the sky. He sat very still on the surface of the moon and felt the subsonic language of what lived below move through him, and waited to see what it would make of him, and tried, with a part of himself that was not quite human and not quite anything else, to listen. Above him, the battle finished. The Crestfall Nebula held its light for a moment, gold and copper and that deep arterial red, and then the stars came through, clear and uncountable, the way they always are when the fire has gone out and the only thing left is the dark between everything, which is not empty, which is full of things the maps haven't found yet, which is patient in the way that only things that have been here a very long time know how to be patient. Below the iron surface of the moon, something paused in its movement through the tunnels, and turned, not toward a threat, not toward heat to be pursued or sound to be hunted, but toward something new. Something that had come from the surface and was not moving and was not loud and was, for the first time, simply present. The subsonic pulse went out. Rin felt it in his bones, and for the first time in his life, something answered.